Stop scrolling right now. I'm about to tell you a story that Hollywood rejected 3 times because they thought it was too unbelievable for audiences to accept. May 16, 1940, a single French tank, one crew of 3 men, held off an entire German panzer division for over 4 hours, destroying 13 enemy tanks, knocked out 2 artillery pieces, and killed or wounded over 100 German soldiers before finally being overwhelmed, not by enemy fire but by running out of ammunition. The German commander who finally captured the position reportedly saluted the French crew and allowed them to keep their arms, a mark of respect almost never given to enemy combatants. The tank commander was Lieutenant Pierre Billet, and what he did that day wasn't just heroic, it was tactically impossible, according to every military manual written before or since. By the end of this investigation, you're going to understand why this single engagement changed German armor doctrine, why it's studied in every military academy in the world, and most importantly, why the lessons from this one tank holding the line alone are more relevant today than ever in an age of autonomous weapons and battlefield AI. This isn't just history. This is a masterclass in why human decision-making under impossible odds still matters when all the technology in the world says you should be dead. Let me paint the picture because the context is everything. May 1940, France is collapsing. The German blitzkrieg has shattered French defensive lines, and panzer divisions are racing toward the English Channel, trying to cut off and encircle the entire British expeditionary force plus hundreds of thousands of French troops. The strategic situation is catastrophic. French command is in chaos. Communication has broken down. Units are retreating in disorder or simply dissolving as soldiers abandon their positions. This is the fall of France happening in real time, and everyone knows it. The war, for practical purposes, is already over in the minds of most French commanders. They're trying to save what they can and establish some kind of defensive line further south. But nobody seriously believes they can stop the German advance into this disaster rides. Lieutenant Pierre Billet, commanding a Char B-1 bis heavy tank, which is arguably the best tank in the world in May 1940. The Char B-1 bis is a beast. It weighs 32 tons, has armor up to 60 millimeters, thick on the front, which makes it effectively immune to most German anti-tank weapons at that time. It mounts 2 guns, a 75 millimeters howitzer in the hull and a 47 millimeters anti-tank gun in the turret. And it has a top speed of about 28 kilometers per hour, which is slow by modern standards, but respectable for 1940 on paper. It's superior to anything the Germans are fielding. The Panzer IIs and Panzer IIs that make up the bulk of German armor have thinner armor and less powerful guns, but wars aren't won on paper. And by May 1940, German combined arms tactics and operational tempo are overwhelming French technical superiority. Billet's tank, named after a region in Normandy, is part of the 1st Armored Division, which has been committed to a desperate counterattack near the town of Stunnes in northeastern France. Stunnes sits on a critical road junction. Whoever controls it controls the movement of forces in the entire sector. The Germans needed to continue their advance. The French needed to have any hope of stabilizing the front. The town has changed hands multiple times over the previous days, with brutal fighting that's left it largely destroyed. On the morning of May 16th, German forces have taken the town again, and French command orders another counterattack to retake it. But the counterattack falls apart almost immediately. French infantry that's supposed to support the armor doesn't show up, either because orders never reached them or because units have already disintegrated. The other tanks in Billet's unit are either disabled by mechanical problems, which were chronic with the Char B-1 despite its technical sophistication, or they're knocked out by German fire as the attack develops. Within the first 30 minutes of the engagement, Billet realizes he's effectively alone. His tank is the only operational French armor in the immediate area. Behind him, the road is clogged with retreating French troops. In front of him, the town of Stunnes is occupied by German forces including armor, artillery, and infantry. The sensible thing, the thing that every ounce of military training and doctrine says to do, is withdraw. A single tank without infantry support, without backup, operating alone in an urban environment against a prepared enemy, that's a suicide mission. You withdraw, you preserve the asset, you fight another day. Billet doesn't withdraw. And this is where the story becomes both fascinating and instructive about human decision-making under extreme conditions. He makes a calculation that's part tactical analysis and part sheer bloody-minded determination. He knows that if German forces continue advancing through Stunnes, they'll overrun the French units falling back behind him. He knows that the road junction is strategically critical, and he knows that his tank, with its heavy armor and 2 powerful guns, has the capability to at least delay the Germans even if it can't stop them permanently. So he positions the at a choke point in the road leading into Stunnes, where the terrain and buildings create a natural funnel that will force German armor to approach from predictable directions, and he prepares to fight alone. The German forces in Stunnes initially don't take the single French tank seriously. Why would they? It's one tank. They've got an entire panzer division. They've been steamrolling French resistance for 2 weeks. One isolated tank isn't a threat, it's a target. The first German response is to send 3 Panzer III tanks to deal with it. This should be straightforward. 3 against 1. The French tank is outnumbered and unsupported. Engage from multiple angles. Saturate it with fire. Knock it out, and move on. Except it doesn't work out that way. The Panzer IIs come around the corner into Billet's firing lane, and he opens up with both guns. The 47mm anti-tank gun in the turret fires armor-piercing rounds that can penetrate Panzer III armor at combat ranges. The 75mm howitzer in the hull is firing high explosive that, even if it doesn't penetrate, is creating enormous concussive force in breaking tracks. The first Panzer III is hit and disabled within seconds. The second takes a 47mm round through the front armor and catches fire. The third tries to back up, realizes it can't maneuver quickly in the narrow street, and takes a 75mm round that blows off its track. 3 German tanks disabled or destroyed in less than 2 minutes. The Germans regroup and try again. This time they send more tanks and they try to use infantry to spot and support. But Billet has positioned perfectly. The choke point means German tanks have to come at him from predictable angles where his frontal armor is strongest. His 60mm of frontal armor is shrugging off the 37mm rounds from German Panzer IIs, and the 75mm rounds from Panzer IVs at these ranges aren't consistently penetrating either. He's effectively immune to their main armament as long as he keeps his front toward them and doesn't expose thinner side or rear armor. And his guns, especially that 47mm, are lethal to German armor. Over the next hour, 4 more German tanks are knocked out trying to dislodge him. Now the Germans are starting to realize this isn't a minor inconvenience. This is a serious problem. They've lost 7 tanks trying to deal with 1 French tank, and it's still operational. The advance through stun has completely stalled because nobody can get past this single choke point, and this is costing them time, which in Blitzkrieg doctrine is everything. The entire operational concept depends on maintaining momentum, on moving so fast that the enemy can't establish defensive lines. A single tank that's holding up a division for hours is a tactical absurdity, but it's happening. The Germans try artillery next. They bring up to 105mm field guns and try to engage the ER with indirect fire. This is actually dangerous because while the Charby 1's frontal armor can handle anti-tank rounds, a direct hit from a 105mm shell on the thinner top armor could disable or destroy the tank. But Billet sees where the artillery is setting up, and here's where the story gets almost comical in its audacity. He drives forward, closer to the German positions, gets a direct line of sight on the artillery pieces, and starts engaging them with his 75mm howitzer. Artillery pieces are not designed to fight tanks in direct fire combat. They're destroyed or abandoned within minutes at this point. Several hours into the engagement, the Germans are genuinely baffled. This shouldn't be possible. 1 tank, alone, has destroyed or disabled 13 armored vehicles, 2 artillery pieces, multiple support vehicles, and has inflicted over 100 casualties on German infantry that tried to approach with close assault weapons. The entire German advance in this sector has been held up for most of a day by a single tank crew. Senior German commanders are being pulled into dealing with this because the tactical situation has become strategically significant. Inside the ER conditions are nightmarish. The temperature inside the tank is probably well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit from the heat of the engine and the guns firing repeatedly. The crew has been in continuous combat for hours, which means adrenaline, exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological stress of knowing that every second they're alive is borrowed time. They're also running low on ammunition. The Chard B1 carries only 74 rounds for the 47mm gun and 50 rounds for the 75mm howitzer, and Billet has been firing at a high rate to keep multiple German targets suppressed. He knows he's going to run out of ammunition eventually, and when he does, the tank becomes a bunker, unable to maneuver effectively and vulnerable once the Germans figure out they can approach without taking fire. But here's what's incredible about Billet's tactical decision-making throughout this engagement. He's not just firing randomly. He's being selective about targets, prioritizing threats, managing ammunition even under extreme stress. Every shot is calculated. Is this target worth a 47mm round? Can he suppress this German position with a near miss from the 75mm instead of trying for a direct hit? He's fighting smart, not just fighting hard. And that's why he's still alive hours into an engagement that should have killed him in the first 15 minutes. The Germans try one more major push. They mass armor and infantry. They coordinate the attack carefully, and they come from multiple directions trying to overwhelm Billet through sheer numbers. And it almost works. A Panzer manages to get a side angle on the ER and hits it with a 75mm round that penetrates the thinner side armor. The round doesn't kill anyone inside the tank, but it damages internal systems and starts a small fire. Billet and his crew manage to extinguish the fire, but the tank's mobility is now compromised. They can still traverse the turret and fire the guns, but moving the vehicle is difficult. And then late in the afternoon they run out of ammunition for the 47mm gun. The 75mm still has a few rounds left, but it's less effective against armor. Billet knows the end is coming. He's done everything possible, held the line for hours against impossible odds, but physics and logistics are catching up. A tank without ammunition is just a very expensive pillbox. The Germans, realizing the French tank has stopped firing, approach cautiously. They're not taking any chances after what's happened. When they get close enough to see that the tank is effectively disabled and out of ammunition, they demand surrender. Billet and his crew have no choice. They've fought until they literally cannot fight anymore. And here's where the story takes a turn that tells you everything about how the Germans viewed what had just happened. The German officer who takes Billet's surrender is Major Erwin Rommel. Yes, that Rommel, the future Desert Fox, and Rommel, who has seen a lot of combat and understands both tactics and courage, does something almost unprecedented. He allows Billet and his crew to keep their sidearms when they surrender, which is a formal mark of respect for a courageous enemy who has fought with honor. He reportedly tells Billet something to the effect of, "You and your men have fought magnificently. You have nothing to be ashamed of." This is enemy combatants acknowledging each other's valor in a way that transcends the immediate conflict. Now let's talk about why this engagement matters beyond the immediate tactical situation. First, it had a real strategic impact on the Battle of France. The 4 to 5 hours that Billet held the Germans at stun allowed thousands of French troops to withdraw in relatively good order and establish defensive positions further south. Those troops lived to fight another day. Some of them evacuated through Dunkirk to Britain. Some continued resisting in southern France. The time Billet bought with his lone tank translated directly into lives saved and units preserved. Second, and this is where it gets really interesting for military doctrine, the engagement forced German commanders to completely reassess their assumptions about armor tactics. The Blitzkrieg doctrine was predicated on the idea that speed and combined arms coordination could overcome individual technical superiority, and it generally worked. But stun showed that a single technically superior tank with a skilled crew in the right tactical position could completely disrupt that doctrine. One tank shouldn't be able to hold up a division, but it did, and that meant German armor tactics needed to be rethought. Post-war analysis of stun shows up in German tactical manuals and training documents. The lessons are clear. Never underestimate a well-positioned defender with superior armor. Always commit sufficient force to overwhelm defensive positions quickly rather than feeding in units piecemeal. And most importantly, respect the enemy's capability regardless of the broader strategic situation. The Germans had been winning the Battle of France so decisively that they'd started to underestimate French combat effectiveness. Billet reminded them, painfully, that underestimation kills. Third, and this is the lesson that's most relevant today, the engagement demonstrates the continuing importance of human decision-making in warfare even when technology advances. The Char B1 bis was technically superior to German tanks in 1940, but most French Char B1 South were either destroyed or captured without achieving anything like what Billet achieved at stun. The difference wasn't the technology, it was the crew. It was leadership, tactical judgment, courage under fire, and the willingness to make decisions that defied doctrine when the situation demanded it. We're moving into an era of increasingly autonomous weapons systems, of AI-assisted targeting, of remote-controlled and semi-autonomous combat vehicles. And there's a temptation to believe that technology will be the deciding factor in future conflicts. But stun is a reminder that the human in the loop still matters. An AI probably would have calculated that staying in position was tactically unsound and would have recommended withdrawal. And according to pure mathematical analysis of force ratios and probability of survival, that recommendation would have been correct. But Billet made a different calculation that took into account factors that are hard to quantify. The strategic importance of buying time for units to escape, the psychological impact of making the Germans fight for every meter, the possibility that heroic resistance might inspire others. These are judgment calls, not calculations, and they require human intelligence and human courage. Let me also address something that often gets left out of heroic war stories. Billet and his crew were terrified. This wasn't superhuman fearlessness. In post-war interviews, survivors from similar situations consistently report that the fear was overwhelming. But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite fear. Billet knew the odds. He knew he was probably going to die. He chose to fight anyway, because it was the right tactical decision, and because someone had to hold the line. There's also a broader lesson here about the nature of defensive warfare and the advantages of prepared positions. Throughout military history, defenders in good positions with adequate supplies have been able to hold off much larger attacking forces. Thermopylae, the Alamo, countless other examples. What makes stun different is that it was one armored vehicle, which changes the math. Armor is supposed to be a breakthrough weapon, not a defensive one. Tanks are for attacking, for exploitation, for mobile warfare. Using a tank as a static defensive position goes against everything in armored doctrine. But Billet understood that sometimes you use the tools you have for the mission you need to accomplish, regardless of what the doctrine says. Modern tank crews study the Battle of Stun not because they expect to find themselves in exactly that situation, but because it teaches principles. Position matters. Ammunition management matters. Keeping your most armored side toward the threat matters. Target prioritization matters. And perhaps most importantly, understanding when to deviate from doctrine matters. Rules and tactics and standard operating procedures exist for good reasons, but they're guidelines, not laws of physics, when the situation demands it. Intelligent deviation from doctrine can be the difference between success and failure. There's also a psychological dimension to this story that's worth examining. The impact on German morale of having a division held up for hours by a single tank was significant. German after-action reports from Stun described frustration, confusion, and a sense of having lost the initiative. That single tank became psychologically larger than its physical presence. It represented French resistance at a time when German forces had started to assume French collapse was inevitable, and that psychological impact had tactical consequences. German forces in that sector became more cautious, more deliberate, less willing to take risks. That's the opposite of what Blitzkrieg doctrine requires. Conversely, for French forces, news of what Billet had done at Stun spread rapidly and became a morale boost at a time when morale was catastrophically low. Yes, France was losing the war. Yes, the strategic situation was hopeless, but at least one French tank crew had fought like lions and shown the Germans that French soldiers could still fight effectively. That mattered psychologically even if it didn't change the ultimate outcome of the campaign. Now let me talk about what happened to Billet after the surrender, because it's relevant to understanding the respect he'd earned. He was taken prisoner, sent to a POW camp in Germany, and spent the rest of the war in captivity. But his treatment was notably better than standard POW treatment, apparently because Rommel and other German officers had spread the word about his conduct at Stun. After the war, he was decorated by France, continued his military career, and eventually reached the rank of general.